Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Cover to Cover. I'm your co-host for today, Beth Eun-hee Hong.
And I'm Naomi Ng.
Today we have a very special guest. We are speaking with Taylor Bradley, co-founder of the publishing house Honford Star.
Welcome, Taylor, to the KH Podcast Studio. It's great to have you here. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and Honford Star?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Honford Star. I started it with Anthony Bird in 2016. We do translated fiction from East Asia, and so far we've done about 10 or 15 books. We've averaged about 3 or 4 a year. We're trying to get our numbers up, though. And we started doing with classics from East Asia. So we started with like Kim Dong-in and Kang Kyung-hae and a Taiwanese author. And after those initial books, we switched over to a more modern line. So we have started doing books from all over East Asia. Yeah.
Great. And 2022 has been a huge year for translated Korean literature. 2 works were nominated for the International Booker Prize, including one of Honford Star's publications, Bora Chung's Cursed Bunny. It went on to be shortlisted, actually, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That was huge for us.
Yeah, and we were excited too because we've had Bora on our show. This must have been a momentous milestone for everyone involved. Can you walk us through some of the highlights for Honford Star this year?
Well, this year was definitely our biggest year by far. And a lot of that was due to the Booker nomination. You know, like one night, Anthony got a phone call from the Booker people saying, like, we're sending you an NDA. Can you sign it? And we were like, ooh, like, what could this be? And, you know, then we got the NDA and, like, then it was announced that we get we would be on the long list, that Cursed Bunny would be on the long list. And then, you know, that immediately forced us to go into reprints as fast as we could, just, you know. So there was a lot of, like, technical work to get all that straight. And then that was great. And then the shortlist hit, and that was another bump. So, like, more reprinting, and then there was more interviews, and then that was just us. Bora Chung and Anton Hur, the translator, they had to do a bunch of interviews and preparation. And so that was our big, like, so that was, like, obviously the biggest part of the year. But then, like, we also did 3 other books, 2 Korean books. One of the books was by Bae Myung-hoon. We did his sci-fi anthology Tower, and this was it's not a sequel, but it's kind of like a spiritual successor called Launch Something, where the Korean Space Force of, like, the 2050s or 2060s have to deal with outer space problems, and it's kind of a farce. It feels like Bae's take on the Korean military, and some light satire. And then we did a collection of short stories by Park Kyung-ni, and she's most famous for Toji, of course. But we did, like, a collection of short stories that she wrote before she started Toji. And we used 7 different translators to kind of have a dry run in case we wanted to do a larger work of hers, which we have not announced yet.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
So a bit more about how you choose the books that you want to print at Honford Star. Its stated mission is to publish the best literature from East Asia. I'm curious how you define best literature from East Asia.
That's partially just marketing. A lot of, I guess best from East Asia would be what Anthony and I both agree on. So take, for example, Cursed Bunny, where Anton he had already translated 2 stories, and he was, like, pitching it to different companies and different publishers. And so he sent it to us, and we loved it immediately. And so, you know, we just we read 2 stories and we said, okay, this is great. Let's do this as soon as we can get the money. And our process is kind of like that. We find a sample or we find something that interests us, and if Anthony and I both turn the keys at the same time, like it's a go. And if one of us doesn't like it, the other person can talk them into it or just move on. And however, and so that differentiates us from some other publishers, especially the major ones, who are more looking for like how well it'll sell, what kind of market there is for things like that, that we don't have the resources really to do, and we don't have the interest either to like try to focus test or anything like that. And that frees us up to do some, kind of some like more, what's the right word? Not like avant-garde, but more like
off the wall.
Yeah, exactly. Like a little less common. Yeah, for example, we did a semi-fictionalized memoir from a 70-year-old Chinese man who he lived through the Cultural Revolution, and then after that, like he was sent to a work camp for a while, and then after that, he grew up and became like a pretty famous playwright and screenwriter and opera. And so the translator, Jeremy Tiang, he had already completed the entire book, and I guess nobody was interested in it. Maybe because it's not obviously marketable. There's no like obvious hook. I mean, the author is up there in age and a lot of things, but as soon as we read it, we were like, yeah, like let's do this. And so we kind of have a flexibility there that maybe other publishers don't have, because we're just 2 guys making a decision about whatever like interests us.
So it sounds like your editorial process is basically you guys, and you sort of go off of your vibes, I guess.
Yeah, I think you could describe it as a vibe-based process. We also work like with our translators. Like we get a lot of pitches from them. Like I mentioned, Curse Bunny and The Ninth Building. That was the book about the Cultural Revolution. And there's a Japanese book that was pitched to us by the translator. So we have kind of this like network of people whose tastes we like, and we get like recommendations from them. And so like sometimes, for example, we did a book called Astral Season, Beastly Season. It's a Japanese book, and the translator, I think he just has like a pretty cool taste in books. And so like about a year ago, we were like, hey, like show us what you got. And so like he showed us 3 or 4 books that he thought were really cool, and we chose one of them, and now we're going to publish that either late next year or early 2024.
Great.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Sounds cool. A few days ago, I was editing an article about the LTI Korea, the Literature Translation Institute, and they actually revised their criteria for their annual translation awards, and they made 3 different groups for languages, whereas before they honestly didn't have any categorization. They just any 3 to 4 works like that they thought were the best translations. So I thought this was like indicative of a trend where there's growing demand for translated Korean literature into more languages. Are you guys thinking about expanding your repertoire of languages? Like, is there any plan in the works to publish existing books in other languages?
For example, like publish one of our books in French or or German or something.
Yeah.
No, because that would take a whole new system of marketing and distribution and sales that we don't have set up, and we don't really have time to set up. So, for example, if we wanted to move into France, we'd have to not only pay all the translators and print the books, and we'd also have to have a warehouse, so we'd have to find a distributor, and lots of distributors only want people who have done several books. They don't really, they don't have time for, somebody with only one or two books. So it'd be basically impossible. Not basically. I mean, we could do it if we wanted to, but like it would just be a lot of work for maybe not a lot of reward. And we only own the rights to we only own the English rights to our books, and not even always world English rights. So we own the UK rights for a few books, and we own the world English rights to, like Curse Bunny, we own the world English rights to. And then we can sublicense those to US and India, and just got an email from New Zealand. But for other languages, the rights are still owned by the publisher. So like the first one that was sold after English was Polish. And so there's a cool publisher in Poland called Tajfuni, and they do a lot. They're pretty similar to us. They do a lot of like East Asian literature, and so they bought the Polish rights, and then they're having somebody translate it, and then they'll sell it. And so there's a lot of different. Some of our books, some of the Korean books are in many different editions in many different languages, but not from us.
Earlier, you talked about your selection process. It's more of a based on a gut feeling between you two. But if you think you could pick one book from the current catalog, what would you say best reflects what readers want right now?
I wish I knew a lot better what readers want right now, because we would select only those books, and we would have a lot more money. So I guess from sales, the people want Curse Bunny, that is our biggest seller, and I think it makes sense. It's kind of this like genre take on like capitalism and patriarchy, and it's kind of like. It's kind of in the same vein as like Parasite or Squid Games or something, like kind of these like
critical look at Korean society.
Right. And so like given the success of those, like this kind of fits into that trend a little bit too.
So it really seems like a process of trial and error in the journey. Would you say any specific book really surprised you this year?
Of ours?
Yeah, as initially you thought, maybe I'm not so sure about this one, but then it really worked out.
The Park Young-ni short story collection, Age of Doubt, that worked out way better than we thought. That was one that was like a passion project, like, like a dead author is always kind of a tough sell, and like these short stories were from the 50s. They're not even her most famous works. So we were kind of surprised by the reaction to it, because we thought like this is kind of a esoteric take on, set of short stories that like we just want to do, and we have some extra money lying around. So like let's go for it. And LTI is very supportive also, and so like. But the reaction has been quite good. Like it's been selling really well. Been getting nice reviews, like online and offline. So I'm really surprised that that the biggest surprise for me, I guess, was like that there's an interest in the 60-year-old depressing short stories about losing your son after the Korean War. Yeah, and being like really poor in 1955. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of interest in Korea generally, like the culture, the history, just beyond K-pop, I think, now. And so it's great to hear that you've had such interest in this, what you first thought would be an obscure kind of author, or I guess setting. Yeah.
Yep.
Not obscure to Koreans, though.
Not at all.
I know she's a titan in the literature
Yeah.
industry here, so yeah.
Taylor, you said before in an interview that this is a golden era for translated East Asian and Korean modern literature. How so?
Well, East Asian literature has been mostly led by Japan for the past, 50 years. There's Nobel Prize winners in the 70s. But for the past, 10 years, 7-10 years or so, Korean literature has become much more prominent, both in like the number of books and the number of books sold. Before, or I would say like, I don't know if other people would say this, but maybe you could put the turning point at The Vegetarian, winning the Booker, and that was very big for Korean literature, I think. And like since then, there's been a lot more mass market publishing of Korean novels. Before that, most Korean stories in translation were serviced by the by university presses. So like there were a lot of like really good professors and university presses that would do anthologies and short story collections and would do really wonderful collections. But sometimes those collections can be targeted mostly just towards students or for author or professors. But in the past 10 years, with The Vegetarian and also Please Look After Mom by Shin Kyung-suk, the number of books have really taken off. And so I think that in one way, like that's part of the golden era. But I also think like the types of Korean books have broadened also. Like, with Please Look After Mom and Vegetarian, you kind of have this narrow focus of like people depressed in Seoul and like, but now like in the past couple of years you've had like The Good Son, which was like a murder mystery about a son who goes on a rampage.
Yeah, you've had like more genres. Sci-fi, Korean sci-fi is one of those genres I feel has been kind of coming up. And
UC Irvine did a short story collection called Ready Made Bodhisattva. That was all Korean short story books. And there's a Kim Bo-young. She was published in the U.S. by one of the major companies. She had 2 books published. And so like Korean sci-fi is on the rise too in a way that has never happened before. And we did 2 of Bae Byung-hun's books. Both are sci-fi. And so it's pretty cool to see like all these different genres being represented in English translation instead of just like kind of a narrow like, oh, I hate my life type of books that were very common before.
Yeah, I mean, you even now have LGBT, right, coming up in this in the literary scene. Like the other nominee for the Booker Prize this year was Park Sang-young's Love in the Big City, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think I could have even imagined that like LGBT Korean novel would be like in the spotlight as it is now 10 years ago.
Yeah, that was a really big. I mean, it was a really big hit. People loved it, obviously. Like, and yeah, like I agree. I don't think you're seeing that 10 years ago. Partially because there might have been less interest on in the UK and the US 10 years ago, but also now that there's more acceptance over there too, like it's easier to perhaps get Korean novels. But also just because like, yeah, publishers are more willing to take a risk on these type of books than they were before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually we're seeing more and more interest in Korean language in general, right, across the world, especially in translating literature. Based on your experience, what do you think are some popular genres or literary translators? Like, is it different for every language, or are there some common themes? Just based on your experience.
Yeah, well, I can't really speak to what type of books are being translated into Turkish or French or German. Though I do know, like, Curse Bunny has been translated into 16 or 20 languages.
Wow.
So it's getting quite popular. So I can say for sure that, that is quite popular. And Tower, the Bae Myung-hun's sci-fi book, was translated into Italian. And they're going to do another book by him. So, like, I definitely think Korean sci-fi is taking some steps worldwide. And as you mentioned, the translators, I think a lot of that is due to, like, translator interest. translators can often act as like unofficial agents, much to their dismay, but also it also gives them a chance to like create their own work and get the books that they really feel passionate about out there, on top of giving them a lot of extra work on top of their normal stuff. But so like the translation community in Korean, at least the English or Korean to English translating community, they seem very interested in a broad range of things. Like Anton Hur and Soje have done a lot of LGBT books. Soje did a book about she pitched to us a book called To the Warm Horizon, which is about two girls who fall in love in a post-pandemic.
Yeah. Lesbians in the Apocalypse.
Yeah.
We talked about that during her interview. Yeah.
And that book was published in like May 2020, the absolute worst time possible for a pandemic love story. And then like other translators are more into like science fiction. So Sung Yu, she did Tower with us, and then she and Sophie Bowman did Kim Bo Young's sci-fi collection for the U.S. For a different publisher. And both of those, I believe, started from like their personal interest. And so like the translation community has a wide variety of interests, and I think are very important in like kind of spreading out the types of books that get brought into English.
And Taylor, what are some of your personal favorite translated Korean works from 2022?
To be honest, I've only read ours.
If from there you could name one.
Yeah. You're making me choose between Bae Myung-hoon's Launch Something and then the Park Kyung-ni book, they Age It Out. Bae's Living, so I will say Bae Myung-hoon's Launch Something was my favorite.
And tell us a little bit more about the reasons why.
He has a very sardonic sense of humor, and he kind of has like a very funny look into the Korean military and like life inside the military. He almost makes it seem like a high school. Like you have the principal, and then you have the popular athlete who's great at everything, and then you have the talkative one, and all while wrapped up in these like like interconnected short stories that you get like mysteries, and you get some action towards the end, and you get some like political drama and thrillers all in one book.
So speaking of favorite books, are there any favorite projects or things that you're really looking forward to at Honford Star for the upcoming year?
Yeah, next year we have some cool books coming up. Of interest to Korean readers, I suppose, would be next spring we have a book by Hwang Yeo-jung called Spectres of Algeria. That's excellent. It was her debut novel. It won some prizes and picked it up. It's kind of a neat little story, like about like the repercussions of the Chunduan era and how that like continues down until today. Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's pretty heavy.
Yeah. It's kind of it's a pretty serious book, but I think people are really gonna like it. And then in the fall we have a new book by Bora Chung, and it's gonna be our first hardcover. So we're really excited about that, and so we're gonna really putting a lot of effort to make it a really cool looking book. And Anton's working on the translation right now, and Bora's out there just giving interviews all over the place, and so like hopefully like that'll come together to be something really cool next fall.
Well, we really look forward to what's on the horizon. Thank you, Taylor, so much for joining us today, and for our listeners out there, you can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Please tweet us or leave us a comment with your favorite translated Korean work of 2022.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
유럽에서 100일이라는 책을 좀 추천하고 싶은데요. 이게 되게 그림체가 되게 예뻐요. 그냥 유럽에서 그냥 100일 동안 여행하는 그런 것들을 그냥 그림으로 그린 그런 스토리인데 거기 안에서 사랑도 찾고 좀 자신이 어떤 사람인가에 대해서 찾는 그런 좀 되게 유럽 감성, 겨울 감성, 낭낭한 그런 만화책이에요. 되게 좋은 책이에요.
저는 헤르만 헤세의 데미안이라는 책을 추천하고 싶은데요. 읽을 때마다 다르게 느껴지는 책이라서 자주 읽고 있습니다.
저는 부자 아빠, 가난한 아빠, 로버트 기요사키 거 추천하겠습니다. 소감은 읽고 나서 조금 더 제 인생을 어떻게 그려나가야 될지에 대한 생각을 좀 하게 됐습니다.
네, 저는 김명아 작가님의 작별인사라는 책을 추천하고 싶습니다. 지금 날씨가 되게 추워지고 있잖아요. 근데 좀 따뜻함을 느낄 수 있는 책이 필요하시다면 작별인사라는 책을 읽으면 좋을 것 같고요. 그 책이 담고 있는 의미는 그러니까 인간을 인간으로 하게 만드는 것은 무엇인가 라는 주제로 소설을 쓴 책이에요. 그래서 읽으면서 되게 따뜻함을 느꼈고 그리고 그거에 연관된 방송으로 이제 알쓸 인잡이라는 방송이 있거든요. 최근에 방영한 방송인데 그것도 같이 보면은 좋을 것 같습니다.
네. 저는 천명관 작가의 고래라는 소설을 추천을 하는데요. 그 이야기 전개가 진짜 아예 앞을 예측을 할 수 없는 그런 이야기고 리뷰 중에 할아버지가 얘기해주는 어마어마하게 옛날 이야기 약간 이런 리뷰가 있었는데 그 리뷰가 진짜 정확한 표현이라서 네, 어쨌든 이야기를 예측할 수 없다는 점에서 진짜 재미있는 소설이었던 것 같습니다.